Sanbonani, Sanbonani, Sanbonani. This is the Zulu greeting, which literally means we see you. Sanbonani, we see you, the ones who you walk with, those who are dead and alive. We see you. We welcome you as history wrestles with us and we wrestle with our histories in the present. May you find the courage to speak truths to power as we long for peace in order to piece our revolutions together in the present for the imagined futures. Sanbonani, may we listen in depth as you roll and flow like the ocean. May your streams of knowledge flow abundantly to meet us with our knowledges. Sanbonani, we see you, we welcome you to shed light on matters, to ignite the fires that are within us. May you light the candles in the dark. May your words be the light that we need. May we speak unapologetically. May we seek unapologetically the change in our humanity we long for. Sanbonani, may you speak. Oh, please do speak. Speak for the radical love of justice.
Thank you, Ongeswa Mbele, for the welcome, the greetings, for honoring those that came before us, for recognizing us in the present, and for animating and energizing the space as you have done so powerfully. Thank you. Yes, let's speak. Let's do it. Allow me first to introduce you to the audience. Ongeswa Mbele is an applied theater practitioner, a storyteller, and a published poet. She's a lecturer at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town. She's currently researching the relationship between township youth culture and violence and how applied theater practices can be a tool for social healing and for political healing. And the beautiful piece that you heard as you joined the webinar is by Yusufa Sidibe, who is a Senegalese West African kora player. Kora is the African harp, and it's titled Sacred Sound. Greetings of solidarity, everyone. We recognize the greetings that you have posted on the chat. Thank you very much for the well wishes. My name is Shana Safla. I am affiliated with the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences, as well as the Psychological Society of South Africa. A very, very, very warm welcome. I saw some of the messages that said you are greeting us from very cold parts of the country. So a very warm welcome to the 16th Annual Peace, Safety and Human Rights Memorial Lecture, which is co-hosted by the University of South Africa, but also by the Psychological Society of South Africa and the Pan-African Psychology Union. I especially wish to acknowledge the families of Abdulah Omar, who was South Africa's first democratically elected Minister of Justice, and Mr. Joe Moabi, who is an anti-apartheid activist in whose memory this lecture series was created. Of course, to all the people on today's program, we salute you. Thank you. And to you, the audience members, we are really, really excited to have you join us, and we see that some of you are joining us from different parts of the world. We hope from warmer parts of the world. It's really good to have you join us. Thank you. I'd like to start with a brief background to the series, if I may. The series aims to highlight the new frontiers and challenges that are facing, in particular, the culture of safety, peace, and human rights in South Africa, but also globally. And in this way, to bring focus to issues that are particularly related to matters of freedom and independence and citizenship in the 21st century. And we hope in this way to inspire us meaningfully to implement the ideals of freedom and social justice. And I have to say that the series has evolved in quite interesting ways over its lifetime. I would say most notably over the last 3 years, where we have seen the lecture format move towards more, I would say, plural and collective modes of engagement. And we think that the two people in whom we honor today would have liked this. They would have wanted this. To say a little more about that, in 2019, for example, the panel included women from the Black consciousness movement. And last year, members from the apartheid era victims' families group. This year, and as a very, very exciting first for the lecture series, the panel is made up of a transnational collective of scholar activists and activist scholars about whom you will hear more shortly. And as for this year's theme, which you probably have seen already, titled Solidarities, Global Social Justice and Radical Humanism, we believe that comrades Omar's and Moabi's contributions, which are really, I think, insurgent enactments of the political philosophical values that underpin the lecture of this theme, are particularly pertinent in this moment of suffering, but also in this moment of rebellions and revolt against suffering. And this moment is what Marxist sociologist, cultural theorist, and political activist Stuart Hall would call a conjuncture. And he says a conjuncture is the period during which different social, political, economic, and ideological contradictions that are at work in society come together to give it a very specific shape and a very distinctive shape. And he says what drives it forward is usually a crisis, when the contradictions that are at play in any historical moment are condensed, come together in what some people have called a kind of ruptural unity. So crises for him are moments of potential change, but the nature of their resolution, he says, is not given. For Stuart Hall, a conjuncture is both a moment of threat and a moment of opportunity. And we know this about crises, yes? It's something to intervene in. It's a configuration in whose components there needs to be some kind of rearrangement, and typically rearrangement through practice, through doing. And so what he says really is that it's a call to action, intellectual, social, cultural, political, and probably a range of other forms of action. And the impulse for the calls to action at this time, including the call for Solidarities, global social justice, and radical humanism, is driven through radical critiques of the modern world, yes, but most essentially by the lived experiences, the very real, felt, visceral, corporeal, material, and witnessed experiences of a number of things. And I'll name some: of anti-Black racism, racial capitalism, apartheid, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, Islamophobia, sexism, heteropatriarchy, ableism, nationalism, xenophobia, and there's much more. All of which we know places some individuals and some groups as outside of humanity and sees these lives as disposable. And most recently in South Africa, we know that these calls for action became particularly amplified as we saw historical and contemporary fault lines, which have already been deepened with the pandemic, and the legacies of empire and apartheid become more strikingly exposed. So this conjunctural moment and its associated calls for change builds, of course, on the radical visions. I should say I'm going to use the word radical a great deal today. Builds on the radical voices and visions that have preceded it. And now more than ever, engaging possibilities for change in our thinking and in our doing is to do the work towards the praxis of radical humanism. And on this, I have to quote, psychiatrist and political philosopher Frantz Fanon said, and I find this so deeply profound, which is why I want to share it. He said, I want the world to recognize with me the open door of every consciousness. So this implied reimagining and revisioning and praxis of being human is then also to look at the hope that is engendered in the promise of a radical humanism. Simultaneously, this calls into focus conversations about how we imagine solidarities, how we build solidarities, how we deepen solidarities across geographical spaces, social spaces, epistemological spaces, probably other spaces too. As is very much mirrored, I think, in the organization of this year's lecture and certainly the representation at this year's lecture. So with that, I'd like to turn to the messages that together with Onge's opening, will usher in the discussions that are being promised today and usher in the panelists' input. We have two opening messages. These will be followed immediately by messages shared by the Omar family and the Moabi family. The Omar family message will be delivered by Professor Nadera Shalhoub, who is the former director of the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape, that's here in South Africa. And the Moabi family message is to be conveyed by Stephen Sheehi Moabi, who is the eldest grandchild in the Moabi family. But first, a brief introduction to Professors Masimola and Sekgalo. So I'll move on then to introduce you to Professor Shalhoub. She is the professor of psychology that currently holds the position of the Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair at the University of South Africa. Her research work and publications cover a wide range of areas, and these include gendered experiences of women in various aspects of life, historical trauma, participatory research, and decolonization. She is a member of the South African Young Academy of Sciences and is currently the president of the Forum of African Psychology. Professor Sekgalo, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Safla. And good afternoon, colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen joining us this afternoon for this very important lecture. I'm really honored to have been given this opportunity to offer a few thoughts on the topic, but also just an overall message as we deliberate today and have discussions on this important topic. I would like to start by just asking and say, when we think about global social justice, we need to pause and begin our conversation by acknowledging, for example, the brutal murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in the United States by white police officers. His death, as we all know, has led to what became a slogan, "I cannot breathe." We need to begin our conversation by reflecting on the video that went viral of a white woman investment banker in Central Park calling the police on a black man bird watcher, claiming he was threatening her life as he taped the interaction. And here, ladies and gentlemen, I echo W.E.B. Du Bois's question, what does it feel like to be a problem? And I go further to ask, what does it feel like to constantly be treated as a subhuman being who is made to feel like he or she does not belong in the world? she or he does not belong in a public park in the middle of New York. As we reflect on Omar and Moabi's lives and think about the importance of solidarities across borders, we need to consider ways in which we can address an always bleeding rip in our collective humanity. Things like gender-based violence, white police killing Black men and women in the United States, and children locked up in cages at the border. We also need to recognize that the Mediterranean Sea is fast becoming the world's largest death trap for migrants desperate to flee the conflict and poverty-stricken continent of Africa. Many have christened it as the world's largest mass grave. And here, the irony when we think back, when history comes to mind and think about the slave trade and thinking about how the sea has always swallowed Black bodies, has always swallowed Black lives. But of course, it has changed today when people go and attempt to get to other spaces and other places in search of a better life. And we need to understand this contextually and understanding and asking ourselves, how did we come to end up here? The Mediterranean Sea has been seen as the cemetery of the determined souls who want to reach Europe for a better life. Since 2014, more than 20,000 migrants and refugees have died at sea while trying to reach Europe from here in Africa. So how can peace be imagined in this unwell and diseased world? We need to take a moment and imagine human rights as a responsibility that all of us carry. And this comes with us doing serious introspection and asking, how does the work we do contribute towards a just society? Carolyn Kagan and colleagues remind us of the interconnectedness of global crises and how it affects the lives of people, including the economic, socio-cultural, political, and ecological crisis, as well as the crisis of violence more broadly. All these are situated at the intersection of public policy and people's lived experiences, whether this happens in our own individual families, in our communities, in our workplaces, and how these influence how social institutions operate in different places. Carolyn and colleagues also paradoxically present opportunities for resistance and hope. How when we are confronted with these challenges, we never lose hope. We always find ways to resist the injustices that are confronting us, to find ways that we can, in solidarity, resist what is unjust in society. So in the midst of all these struggles confronting us, we have to continuously seek ways to hold space for each other, to mourn together, to always have at the center the reminder that our humanity is relational. We are interconnected, and our suffering does not happen in isolation. Nthabiseng Motseme, a sociology scholar, argues that making efforts to link our stories to the everyday practices and fractured meanings of existence of individuals and communities is indeed a challenge, but also part of the unavoidable search of telling the free and democratic stories. So we must always find ways to tell our stories, to challenge the status quo. If we are to imagine social justice, we need to create the spaces for multiple converging and diverging stories to be told. From the global north and the global South, because I believe that it is at these often uncomfortable intersections that possible change and solidarities may be initiated. And now, ladies and gentlemen, with these few words, I would like to conclude with Nelson Mandela's words, where he reminds us that as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly rest. I look forward to the panel address and discussions this afternoon. And with these few words, I thank you.
Thank you so much for that strong message, Professor Sekgalo. Strong voice. Thank you so much. I apologize on behalf of Professor Masimola, who's having some technical difficulties, but he is able to join us telephonically. So we're going to try and make space for that. But before we do, I would like to say a little bit about our dean. He's the executive dean of the College of Human Sciences at the University of South Africa, which is where the Institute for Social and Health Sciences is located. He is a full professor of English, highly published. He holds the distinction of having won many, many research excellence awards, and is highly respected in the many academic systems in which he interacts. So, Professor Masimola, we're really sorry that you're not able to join us directly on the webinar platform, but we're very grateful that you've tried to convey the message to us through other means. So, Fatima, I understand that you're going to manage this part for us. Thank you.
Correct, Prof. You may begin.
Hey, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this all-important lecture. And I'd like to acknowledge the deep sincerity with which Professor Mohamed undertakes this activism, and I think this event speaks as much about the way in which he takes matters of human rights to heart. And I want to extend my special thanks to the Moabi family and the Abdulah families for giving us permission to enjoy this enduring and lasting legacy of activism and justice. I'm proud as a Unison to be associated with this event this year. And I want to think that all of us here present understand the great significance of this event.
We have two messages that I think we should proceed to. I will now rely on the admin team, the technical team, to share the messages from the families of Abdulah Omar and Joe Moabi. Thank you, Fatima Mohammed. I hope that you'll be ready to do that. Perhaps I could say a little bit about the late Abdulah Omar and Joe Moabi. First, we remember them especially for having fought a resolute battle against inequality and oppression. Their legacies remind us in all kinds of ways that the fight against oppression and tyranny, not only in South Africa, but really across the world, is an interminable one, and one which we are summoned and challenged ongoingly, really ongoingly, to renew our individual commitment and our collective commitment to the cause of equality and freedom. And what we were hoping to do was share with you a brief look at their profiles, in addition to the messages that the families have shared as we honor them today, especially for their remarkable legacies of activism and service. So I'm going to take literally a second to check if the technical team is ready to do this for us. If not, we shall move on. Fatima Mohammed, can you?
Yes, everything's ready.
Thank you. Let's proceed. Thanks so much.
to be asked by the Omar family to say a few words of thanks to the organizers of this panel for the tribute to the late Dala Omar. I'm also pleased because the panel takes into account a very crucial aspect of the legacy of the late Dala Omar, namely his commitment to the question of humanism. I want to say that for Dala Omar, humanism was not something that was a matter of received wisdom. Neither was it something that could be cloaked in political sophistry. Dala believed in an idea of humanism that had to be lived every day. It had to be worked on every day. It had to be something that one strives for, a work in progress. And so, as a student activist in the 1980s, the opportunities that many of us had to engage with Dala always brought home the importance of this ongoing work of humanism. It is fitting that we pay tribute to someone like Dala Omar today. His is a humanism that we all should strive for, that we all should learn to believe in, and that we should all work towards building every day of our lives. And so on behalf of the Omar family, I want to thank the organizers of this event. I want to thank the University of South Africa. I want to thank particularly the speakers who have assembled here for paying tribute to a very, very important thinker of our liberation struggle. Thank you.
Atiba, can you tell us whether you're ready? Thank you. I see you are. Thank you.
Greetings and thank you to the panelists and the hosts at the University of South Africa, the Psychological Society of South Africa, and the Pan-African Psychology Union, all protocol observed. My name is Itumeleng Moabi, first grandchild of Joe Moabi, whom we, as his grandchildren, fondly called Kulu. The Moabi family has asked me to convey the message of thanks for this year's Peace, Safety and Human Rights Memorial Lecture for Kulu today. To them I am thankful for giving me this honor on such a huge platform. As a family, we thought dedicating a poem which we think encapsulates Kulu's beliefs well. He always encouraged his children, Auntie Nana, my dad Popoza, and Uncle Khotso, to be the best they can be. He did the same with all children that came into contact with him. This poem, we feel, also encapsulates the work he did at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences in UNISA. It's a short poem by Miriam Williamson titled Our Deepest Fear. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine, as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, Our presence automatically liberates others. The family continues to ask for prayers for my aunt Nana Peto, who was diagnosed with motor neurons disease in 2018. Her condition continues to be stable, and we thank the Lord above for his divine intervention in blessing her. I thank you.
Thank you. And now it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce the lecture panelists. May I please ask you to switch on your cameras at this point? Rosa, Stephen, Nadera, Itumeleng. Thank you. Itumeleng will switch on her camera shortly. Yes, as I've already remarked, these four people represent a transnational group of very impressive and actually very, very lovely individuals whose scholarly and activist labor is undertaken with, and I'm going to do it again, with radical consciousness, radical love, radical rage, and radical imaginings through radical solidarities and insistence of a world otherwise. They are friends, they are comrades, old and new, whose work is uncompromisingly at a revolutionary edge during this time of global upheaval, and here I mean generative and not. We are admirers of their scholarship and activism. We are deeply appreciative of their solidarity and their generosity, and are delighted that they've accepted our invitation to serve on this year's lecture panel. I will introduce each of the four panelists before they speak. We will hold off on comments until the end of the panelists' input. when Professor Garth Stevens, who is our moderator, will offer reflections and take up questions from the audience in conversation with the panelists. Audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A function to share your comments and also to pose questions to the panelists. May we please have then Professor Stephen Sheehi's bio up on a slide. Professor Sheehi, I believe you will now ignite the fire. So I'll introduce you briefly. Stephen Sheehi is the Sultan Qaboos Professor of Middle East Studies in Asian and Middle East Studies Program and Modern Languages and Literatures Department, as well as the core faculty member of the Asian and Pacific Islander Studies Program at William and Mary, which is in the USA. He's also the founding director of the Decolonizing Humanities Project. He's a scholar of modern Arab culture, photography, politics, Islamophobia, and racism in North America, and decolonial studies. As a lifelong anti-racist, anti-colonialist, and anti-capitalist activist committed to social justice and economic inequality in the US and the Middle East, our comrade brother remains active within the Solidarity movement, within the BDS movements, working for the liberation of the Palestinian people. He is the author of numerous books, journal articles, book chapters, and op-ed pieces, too many to mention at this time. A very, very, very warm welcome to you, and over to you.
So is that my cue? I'm flattered. Shahnaz, is that?
Hi, I'm handing over to you.
Okay, sorry, my
Yes.
Okay, so
Thank you.
Excuse me. No, thank you so much for the warm introduction. I know we don't have a lot of time. I do want to thank you and Muhammad and all the organizers of this auspicious lecture in honor of Abdulah, Omar, and Joe Moab. I just want to also recognize before I start that I am beaming in from Wellesley, Massachusetts, in what is now known as the United States. This is on occupied and stolen land of the Massachusetts people. And it's important for me always to recognize that, because we are still ongoing the liberation not of indigenous peoples in what is now North America, but also in Palestine. So I will very quickly read this because I know we are probably a bit stuck for time, so do forgive me. I'm happy that Professor Zagallo started off with a number of examples from the United States. So I want to start first by paying tribute to Black Power political prisoners in the American gulags who identify themselves as Muslim. Jalal, particular Jalal Amin, Mumi Abu Jamal, Jamil Muntaqam, Jihad Abdul Munit, Dawood, Abdul Rahman, Abdul Malik Kaaba, Kamu Sadiqi, and Abdul Aziz, formerly Warren Balatin, Malik Bey Smith, Hanif Shabazz Bey, and many others. Alongside Muslim prisoners, Sayyid Hashmi, Afia Sadiqi, Hassan Elayshi, Shukri Abu Bakr, Muhammad al-Mazain, James Cromiti, and Newburgh 4. The high-profile targeting of politically engaged Black American Muslims alert us to the relationship between state criminality against Black people in the United States, as a comrade from Azani had taught me to say, and the ways in which Islamophobia and anti-Arabness work in service of anti-Black structures. Today I'm discussing the relationality of the state's enforcement of white supremacy to the association of Islamophobia and Blackness. That is, Islamophobia in the country now known as the United States is structured by the racialization of Islam within the context, however, of anti-Black American racism in the United States and US imperialism. This relationality, that is, whiteness and the state in relation to Arabness, Muslimness, and Blackness, is calibrated around suppressing and regulating Black consciousness, as Steve Biko would say, or Black presence, as Toni Morrison would say. In other words, Islamophobia is operationalized by the state and civil society to crush Black consciousness. But it does this in the settler colony of the United States under the guise of casual and official Islamophobia that serves as a socially acceptable refuge to cultivate white supremacy. Islamophobia has been an acceptable form of racism in the United States and anti-Arabism for some time. As such, I argue that this sanctioned hate of Arabs and Muslims has allowed anti-Black racism to take refuge and to grow and to resurge within white mainstream political polity. That is, eventually to resurge in the current form of white ethno-nationalism, which is ravaging this country. Islamophobia functions as the supplement for anti-Black racism, to further anti-Black racism by camouflaging the expanding legal and discursive authority of whiteness. Scholars such as Angela Davis, Mark Neocleus, which I thank Nadera for turning me on to, Miriam Kaba and Gio Maher show us how social and ideological systems protect white supremacist racial hierarchy, state power, and the capital accumulation and private property of the ruling classes. These social and ideological systems conscript consent, indeed active approval and support of civil society, including we Black and brown people in that civil society. Within the same context, the security state, in particular, we'll talk a little bit more about the militarization of the police, the federal and local surveillance, and legislation such as the National Defense Authorization Act, and most well known, the Patriot Act in the United States, grew with full support of the whole mainstream political establishment, organizing around the ever-present domestic terror threat of political Islam. It is not white innocence, nor ignorance, nor a lack of imagination that resulted in the collusion of civil society and the federal government with arming local and state law enforcement with, quote, obsolete and unneeded excess property of the United States military units around the world to local enforcement. And that's from a report that I'll reference in a moment. Rather, Islamophobia not only undergirds US imperialism and militarism abroad, but it also underwrites, quote unquote, countering violent extremism discourses, CVE discourses, that justify the national security state or the mukhabarat state, including the militarization of local and state police. So for example, my quote was from a description of program 1033 and LESO, the Law Enforcement Support Office, which repurposed US military weapons to local police in order to prepare better responses and preparedness in the war on terror, quote unquote. These programs directly connect Islamophobia to US imperialism and state-sanctioned mass incarceration and brown people in states. Simone Brown starts off her book, Dark Matters, with the story of how the CIA rejected her Freedom of Information Act request, FOIA request, about Fanon's visit to the United States during the last months of his life. In the figure of Fanon, we see how the United States historically surveilled Black revolutionaries in the US, but also Black revolutionaries involved in the internationalist liberation movements, right? These movements, in other words, are internationalist by nature. We see the confluence of the FBI and CIA surveillance of Black and brown African liberation movements, US Black power activists, Black consciousness thinkers that cut across the Caribbean, Africa, and North America. Brown reveals that the constitutive histories and the surveillance systems with Black communities, within Black communities in a country now known as the United States, and the U.S. security apparatus knows that few degrees of separation lie between Black American communities and those in Africa and the Caribbean. Speaking to these commonalities, remain at the heart of the developing solidarities between our shared commitments to Black and Brown liberation and the demise of global racial capitalism and imperialism as its forward failings. In thinking about our solidarities between the complicity of Black and Brown folk in the country now known as the United States, and I do always want to shine the light back on Black and Brown folks in the United States and our collusion with racial oppression, racial hierarchies. We consider how Islamophobia in relation to state surveillance and the psychic lies about racialized identities in the United States, but also to the policies of social formations of enticement and consent that make us collude with class elements of racial supremacy. So in the social sphere, Islamophobia operates as a tool of social, state, and economic regime built on anti-Black racism. I show elsewhere that Islamophobia as an ideological refuge allowed anti-Black racism to consolidate itself. For example, members of white nationalist groups like Patriots Pride, Identity Europa, and Proud Boys that we've heard so much about over the past pretty much 5 years have been active in groups like Act for America or Pam Geller's Stop Islamization since 9/11, collapsing anti-Black and Islamophobic tropes under the discourses of Western chauvinism. Yet the intimacies and shared pedigrees between Islamophobia and white nationalism exist between law enforcement, the state, including Homeland Security and foreign policy, and these Islamophobic and right-wing groups. For example, in 2017, 9 days before the Unite the Right rampage in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is a fascist riot, basically, the FBI issued a report not about white nationalist extremists, but about, quote, Black identity extremists, BIE. That year, white supremacists were responsible for more than half of what the FBI determined as extremist murders, while Islamic extremists accounted for only 1/4. This FBI report named BIE, including Black Lives Matter, as the top threat to the United States internal security, particularly to US law enforcement. The report names a small handful of BIE attacks on law enforcement, unquote, associating the alleged assailants with the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers, as if there were an actual Black Panthers party still around. Unfortunately, it's not. A year later, Homeland Security decommissioned, in fact, the domestic terrorism unit that watches white nationalist organizations. While the BIE moniker for Black terrorists is not new, numerous governmental reports show the surveillance of Muslim communities is operative in the intensification of policing Black communities, especially policing Black consciousness movements. In 2009, a joint FBI Virginia report identified 2 Black Muslim organizations, including Jamal Amin's, or the formerly Iraq Brown's National Ummah, as an incubator for homegrown Black Muslim anti-government terror. The report felt free to speculate on the potential links between Black separatist organizations and radical Islamic organizations in Virginia, unquote. So we see that Black and Muslims share being an imminent threat. Many, including myself, have written that 9/11 capitalized on anti-Arab racism to realign US or not so US imperial agenda globally. It also empowered the US security state domestically, allowing liberals, including Black folks and brown folks, to align with Islamophobia even as it perpetuates the logic of anti-Blackness. In the years following 9/11, the Arab and Muslim terrorists which would stand in for the figure or trope of the Black militant and the Black criminal. 9/11 provided a sanctioned targeting and hate against Arabs and Muslims with the support of the mainstream US, the very place from which the right-wing resurgence would appear in 2016. To be clear, I am linking the expanded authority of white supremacist legal, political, and ideological systems that has resulted in the murder of Black people by hyper-enfranchised and militarized police in the United States to the accepted legitimacy of Islamophobia as a mode of organizing political and civil society and policy. Therefore, I'd like to conclude by extending to a group of psychologists this associative relationship between Muslim, Arab, and Black positionalities within structures and institutions that maintain white supremacy. The process of association allows us to perceive patterns of repetition, to perceive a pattern of state surveillance of Black communities by the security state, which Islamophobic security discourses collapse with Muslim communities. The associative process allows us to perceive the relationship between profiling of Muslims and profiling of Black people, between flying while Muslim and driving while Black. The associative process allows us to perceive a pattern of discursive and operational threads that run through the FBI and law enforcement reports that place Muslims and Black people at the center of the US Mukhabarat state. The associative process allows us to perceive a pattern of the material relationship between the systematic incarceration of Black people by police and the judiciary and the systematic surveillance and incarceration of Black and non-Black Muslims by law enforcement, by that same judiciary, all under the pretense of maintaining social order and peace. Cumulatively, the associative process allows us to perceive the pattern of the material and ideological relationship between local, national, and global policing, directly or through proxy, between the murder of Black people by police and the murder of brown people by globally, including in Palestine, by white settlers, by white imperialists, by white supremacists, whether through apartheid, brutal embargoes, settler occupation, military invasion, planes, or drones. Islamophobia is a symptom and an accomplice of anti-Blackness, providing the protection of to the security state by justifying its increase and justifying thereby an increase of militarism and expanding the carceral special administration system. This associative process brings to the surface our solidarity. They make apparent it makes apparent our shared histories and structured alienation, but also our shared identifications and desire. In Fanon's words, it brings to light our, quote, will to liberation. Here, psychologists hold a unique position because, quote, to quote Fanon again, the total liberation involves every facet of the personality. He teaches us, Fanon that is, independence is not a magical ritual, not to bang magical rituals, but an indispensable condition for men and women and all of our siblings to exist in true liberation. In other words, to master all the means necessary for the radical transformation of society. And thank you, Shahnaz, for giving me the permission to say radical. Amandla, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I will move on then to introduce our next panelists. And this is Itumeleng Moabi. I understand no family of Omjo Moabi. Itumeleng is a mother, an eco-villager, a researcher, an activist, a facilitator, and an archivist. She is passionate about peace and justice issues, indigenous knowledge systems, and intergenerational collaboration. She's currently completing her Master's in Developmental Studies, and this is at the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. And here she's looking at the complexities of resistance, particularly in Palestine and South Africa, in the context of comparison of youth activism in a township setting and a refugee camp setting. Itumeleng says she hopes to be president of South Africa one day. Viva to that, my sister. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction that I composed. But yeah, it's really an honor to be invited in the sitting and to share my views. And amazingly and shockingly, I don't know Mr. Joe Moabi, and I've only just learned of him. I had to do some research in preparation for this lecture, and I must say that it is a double honor that I get to meet namesakes and probably family members. We need to do some research on that. But without much further ado, as Prof. Sufla has rightfully pointed out, I've been to Palestine doing research. I don't know, is it okay because the video seemed to have stopped, or is it on? I don't know.
Yes, it's on. We see you.
Okay. I'm just getting a message on my screen. So I'm basing my contribution on that experience because I think I was ill prepared for the experience that I encountered in Palestine, despite the preparations that I did for the research, which was ideally to do a comparison with youth activism in Freedom Park with a refugee camp, one of the largest in Bethlehem, called Deisha Refugee Camp. But immediately when I was there, I was struck by nostalgia of a time in South Africa in which I was never present, but heard so much about, read so much about, and it threw me off from essentially what I was there to do, which was ask young people about protests and their protest activities. But then again, I had to rethink how I'm doing the research, because you cannot just approach people and ask them about protest activities in the height of an active apartheid system and a colonial system. So essentially, when I look at the topic today and we speak about solidarities, global social justice, radical humanism, these are some of the components of what became a series of nostalgic events that swept me away. So I did ask a question on solidarity and what it means to be in solidarity with the Palestinian movement, because what I encountered while I was in Palestine is how fragmented the whole Palestinian national project is relative to where people find themselves in their solidarity levels or their levels of solidarity. One example I must share with everyone is when I was at Bethlehem University with a group of students who were obviously very active because they held some demonstrations during the lunchtime hour on Fridays in the Common Square in the university, Bethlehem University. And I showed them a poster that was prepared by some of the student Peace Must Fall colleagues of mine in Wits University. And immediately they said, okay, remove the slogan because it's saying that our fight is a religious one, because the slogan was speaking to a more religious kind of a quote type of a thing. And they said, no, please remove it because we want to appear as non-religious, non-racial, non-sexist, non-anything, and we're just coming together as a people, and we want solidarity from that standpoint. And that's where we move into the radical humanism. So when I move into the camp, and I'm like, okay, these people are landlocked. This is an active apartheid system. You need a card to move from point A to point B. The areas are sectioned and zoned. How do they get their message across when their Facebook has been monitored, when your social media can land you into jail, when your house can be raided on any night? And this is in the refugee camp where the doors are kicked down every night, including in the NGOs. Young people are setting up NGOs. Young people are building media studios, media-related NGOs. If anything, when you are young, you are volunteering in community organizations. So the spirit of involvement, of community activism is inculcated in children from a very young age. Already you are part of intergenerational conversations that happen through which the baton is passed, the seed is planted and it's nurtured throughout time, right? So a young person, and I'm talking young person as in 7 years old, can give you the history of the struggle of the Palestinian refugees as if they were there themselves. So this is because it's planted in them from an earlier point and nurtured consistently daily. In South Africa, we have what we call political schools, but they are in their infancy in comparison to the level of intergenerational conversations that are happening on the ground in Palestinian refugee camps and Palestinian families, Palestinian communities, any gathering where there's young people and old people. So this is our point of departure when we speak about radical humanism, where we find the connection, the intersection in our humanity. We need to be present. We need to, as Prof. Sekgola earlier pointed out, that we need to hold space for each other. And what does that look like in action? Because while in Palestine, I then had to question my own activism because my research methodology was set out in a way that, okay, I'm a young activist and I'm linking up with another activist on the other side, and we need to come together and collaborate in dissecting what mobilizing and organizing looks like among the youth in our communities, in our respective communities. But what am I active in? What is the nature of my activism? While I'm there snapping pictures, going from wall to wall, going from household to household, corner to corner, shop to shop, interviewing young people. Am I a tourist or am I an activist? And in the context of the context, what am I active in? Because there are many types of activists that I met in Palestine. I met Israeli activists who were there in solidarity with a community that was, I think the video trended on Facebook and people were being hacked out of their homes. And behind the scenes, there's busloads of so-called Israeli activists who are there in solidarity. So is my solidarity the same as their solidarity? So these are questions that I yet, as now, don't have the answers to, but I am hoping that somewhere in the growth and regeneration of my activism, the answers will come across. So the global social justice movement needs to recognize that we are all facing one enemy. As one professor said to me, the director of the Palestinian Museum of Natural History, he pointed out that the only way we can truly show true solidarity is if we can truly resonate with each other's struggle and see it for the similarities, the points of similarities that we share. Because he pointed to me, he said, one time he was invited to a talk in India, and to his surprise, he was quite caught off guard because he was like, why would this remote community in India want to hear from a professor who's unknown in Palestine? And the answer was quite simple. He was told, we are all facing one enemy as communities. So with that, I would like to hold my contribution, and hopefully the questions that come across will spark a much robust debate and further contributions from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Itumeleng. I'd like to move on then to introduce Rosa Castillo, who is an anthropologist and an engaged scholar based at Humboldt University's Berlin's Institute for Asian and African Studies. She works on peace and conflict studies and with a very particular violence on violence and subjectivity, othering affect and emotions, and actually quite a cluster of different foci. She has done a great deal of work to spotlight the work of Filipino scholars and activists in the current context in which she is working. For example, she has started off a Filipino studies group at the Association for Asian Studies, and has also founded the Philippine Studies Series Berlin. I'm not sure that I'm quite doing justice to the introduction, Rosa, but yes, that's Rosa Castillo. We look forward to your input. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanaz. I know that we're running out of time, so that's good that the introduction is a little bit more brief. So good afternoon, everyone. To those who are in South Africa and in Berlin, and good evening to those in the Philippines. Good day, everyone. I hope everyone is well despite these difficult times. And I'd like to thank Professors Mohammed Sidat and Shanaz Sufla, the rest of the organizers, and the Omar and Moabi families for the honor of speaking with you today. Solidarity, greetings. So what I want to do is focus on memory work in struggles against violence, oppression, and dehumanization as a decolonial attitude, posture, proposition, and force, to quote from Catherine Walsh. In particular, I'd like to discuss and draw lessons from the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, adherents who will to remember the atrocities committed against Muslims in the Philippines, as well as stories of survivance and how this shaped their struggle for the right to self-determination. And I hope that along the way, we can draw insights into thinking in the larger questions we want to engage with in this panel on solidarities, global social justice, as well as radical humanism. So I'd like to begin by highlighting the points raised by decolonial scholars who pointed out that colonial representations, repression, and erasure of the colonized people's past are a form of epistemic violence that is instrumental in creating and upholding the coloniality of knowledge, being, and power that divides the world's population into degrees of being human. Thus, the ways in which representations of the past are mired in coloniality is a key battleground in decoloniality. It is a project of counter-ontology that asserts and redefines what humanists ought to be and render present in their own terms those who have been erased, thereby rejecting or contesting coloniality's categorization of humanity. Furthermore, excavating and asserting subjugated pasts can provide, in the words of liberation psychologist Ignacio Martin Barro, and I quote, models of identification that, instead of chaining and caging the people, open up the horizon for them toward their liberation and fulfillment. A critical reckoning of the past and surfacing subjugated past are intrinsic in what indigenous scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith refers to as the critical pedagogy of decolonization that can lead to alternative knowledges and thus alternative ways of doing things. A decolonial approach to memory work should not merely reproduce stories of victimhood that can harden differences and hatred between people. As examples from community psychology and indigenous studies show, and which I also explored through the experiences and narratives of my MILF interlocutors, memories of shared suffering and survivance can instead serve as a guide or resource for groups in liberating themselves from oppressive conditions. Memory work, which involves the interplay of memory and imagination, plays a significant role in the MILF's liberation struggle, which can be seen as a movement towards what Adolfo Alban calls re-existence. These are strategies and mechanisms that question and render visible the practices of racialization, exclusion, and marginalization, to quote from Alban, towards a life of dignity and self-determination. So in my short input, I draw from my long-term ethnographic fieldwork between 2011 and 2018 in mainly rural parts of the Cotabato region in the southern Philippines among politically, socially, and economically non-elite adherents of the MILF. So for those who are not familiar with the Philippines, I'll just give a very quick background. So the Philippines has been profoundly shaped by over 400 years of multiple colonialisms, as well as resistance to the colonial order. One of the enduring legacies of colonialism is the marginalization of Muslims in the Christian majority country. They were disparaged as Moro by the Spaniards, dehumanized as uncivilized, violent, and untrustworthy, and dispossessed of their lands during the American colonial era and by post-colonial governments. contemporary anti-Muslim biases, and the political economic exclusion of Muslims in the Philippines continue to be shaped by these colonial logics. By the 1960s, communal and state violence, the latter targeting Muslim populations, particularly during martial law, led to the birth of the Moro National Liberation Front and eventually the MILF. These groups reconstructed the pejorative label Moro into a positive referent for Muslims as freedom fighters and waged an armed struggle for the Bangsamoros' right to self-determination. Lasting from 1969 to 2019, the protracted war between Moro liberation fronts and the Philippine state killed more than 100,000 and displaced millions. This included massacres committed against Muslim communities by state and non-state actors, the central focus of the MILF and its adherents' memory work. For many Moro I interacted with, massacres and martial law, during which most of the massacres occurred, are the pinnacle of violence against innocent people and is central in their collective identification as an oppressed but valiant people. The MILF, through its UDSTADs and affiliated NGO workers, mediated narratives of massacres in trainings, seminars, mosque sermons, and radio shows. These narratives are passed on as well through storytelling within families and communities. So religious leaders and NGO workers tell stories of the massacres and other atrocities in order to awaken and motivate more youth and to inspire people to continue claiming for their rights. These stories are also told so that people will persevere, so that the past will never be repeated again. Indeed, for many people I talked to, the history of oppression and resistance taught them that they should learn to defend themselves. These messages are especially potent because massacre is not a thing of the past. It continues to be part of people's lived reality and a haunting reminder of what could potentially be. The notion that massacre is an ever-present threat and the possibility of its recurrence compelled Liberation Front leaders and adherents to remember the massacres so that the people's resolve to defend themselves, fight for their rights, and to not let the past happen again is strengthened. For them to remember is a way of exercising control over the present and of directing the future, a project not merely of individuals, but also of the group. So my interlocutors would refer to these massacres and other atrocities in conversations and commentaries in everyday life, in stories told within families, in recalling experiences with violence, in weighing the present, and in imaginings of the future as a counterpoint to the violent past and uncertain present. They would, for instance, invoke massacres when they remark on the violence that their families and villages, and that Moros or the Bangsamoro or Moro Nation as a collective endured, and correspondingly how they must respond individually and collectively. Such conversations are often infused with fellow feelings of pain, sympathy, empathy, pity, and determination, provoked by remembering and imagining this suffering. Meanwhile, the intergenerational transmission of memory, whether through formal events or storytelling within families and communities, by those who survived or witnessed the atrocities, connect individual stories and experiences with a collective story, and bridges generations with each other, producing intergenerational solidarity. Rahib, a farmer in his 20s when I met him, was deeply affected by stories of the massacres that he heard through these formal events, as well as within his family. And even though he never experienced the massacres nor the martial law, when he hears the massacres, he told me that, and I quote him, "It is as though you come to your senses. You fight for the rights of my countrymen and our religion." He was deeply affected because he also experienced violence and wars growing up as a male Moro, often targeted and harassed by soldiers. For him and many others I met during my fieldwork, it was a continuity of violence and injustice in the present, and the presence of past violence in contemporary discourse that made the suffering across generations shared, and the necessity of learning to defend themselves paramount. So memory work entails the travel via discourse of personal biographies of those who witnessed or survived the massacre or atrocity to places far beyond their origins. These biographies become part of stories of violence in other Moro communities where people identify with massacre victims, just as they themselves were subjected to suffering, even if they had never directly experienced a massacre. In this way, imagination bridges the gap between those who have experienced and those who have not, such as the memory of another becomes a part of the self through the work of imagination and its embodiment through fellow feeling. Consequently, these acts of commemoration and imagining forge solidarity and create a sense of shared heritage, whereby the collective identity is marked by oppression and resistance. So accompanying these memories of massacres is the MILF's assertion of Muslim history in the Philippines, hitherto erased or distorted in mainstream historiography. They highlight Muslims' continued resistance throughout the 300 years of Spanish colonization and assert that the Bangsamoro people are oppressed but valiant and unconquered. On the one hand, these assertions tend to gloss over particular Muslim leaders' accommodation of colonial rule. On the other hand, Tuhiwai Smith points out that for those who were colonized, the belief in an authentic self has political currency. Although this may seem overly idealized, she argues, these symbolic appeals remain strategically important in political struggles. She further asserts that, and I quote, the remembering of a people relates not so much to an idealized remembering of a golden past, but more specifically to the remembering of a painful past, remembering in terms of connecting bodies with place and experience, and importantly, people's responses to that pain. Thus, following Tuhiwai Smith, aside from rewriting colonial history, local and more recent stories of bravery also feature prominently in the MILF and its adherents' memory work. Stories of bravery and survivance during the colonial and post-colonial eras, idealized as parts of these narratives are foundational for my interlocutor's political identity and notion of peoplehood, as well as a source of strength, motivation, and belief in the legitimacy of the Bangsamoro struggle. So the will of MILF adherents to remember can thus be seen as a decolonial posture and force in defense of their communities, lands, and Islam. It also shapes the way they can constitute themselves and their collective amidst a violent lived experience and history of oppression and struggle. As a Moro civil society training officer asserts, and I quote her, it is in our past that defines and guides us in our role both in our present and future status as Bangsamoro. It also eases us, as well as outsiders, of the burden of defining what and why we are called Bangsamoro. Remembering and forgetting are, however, not a uniform process for all individuals involved, even if the collective memory is prevalent, impacted as these processes are by material, social, and political conditions and individual circumstances. The past can be contested or have different significance, even among those who belong to the same group of oppressed people. Conversely, the imagined future is also not free from tension or contestation, as the visions of the future and experiences of past suffering and survivance can differ as well, depending on one's position in the hierarchies of power. While I do not have the time to flesh out these nuances, I recognize that a decolonial approach to memory work needs to take these tensions and contestations into account. Despite tensions in memory work, however, its importance in shaping the present and future renders it an integral part of decoloniality. My interlocutor's will to remember is part of their struggle to have a peaceful and prosperous life and a future of self-determination. There are also attempts at breaking the hierarchies of humanness and the colonial logics of violence and subjugation that have inflicted so much suffering on Muslim populations in the country. They are, in other words, to quote from Mohammed Sidat, a disparate community's resistance to hegemonic identity constructions and a quest for generative collective formations. The recent establishment of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, which is currently headed by the MILF, is a historic and important step towards recognizing the Bangsamoro's right to self-determination. It is a victory in their struggle and is thus a step towards a potentially decolonial future if it can enact just and fair governance. To conclude, harnessing the decolonial potential of memory work for local and global liberatory projects necessitate carefully looking at the interplay of memory and imagination and thinking of creative modes of looking at the past, linking it to the present and the future, as well as modes, circulation, and politics of transmission of experiences, narratives, and meanings of the past, and what kind of present and future this memory work tries to build. And while I focus on a local struggle in the Philippines, I suggest that the lessons learned from what the MILF did and how they proceeded with their memory work towards their struggle for rights to self-determination can perhaps be an entry point to thinking through building solidarities across various parts of the world in similar contexts of oppression and excavating subjugated past and surfacing various histories and redefining what humanness ought to be. Conversely, memory work that challenges dominant discourses does not necessarily make for a decolonial project. Such memory work must be accompanied by a sustained critique and pushback against the coloniality of knowledge being in power, and coloniality's material, political, and societal structures and consequences towards a decolonial future of re-existence. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Rosa Castillo. Thank you. That brings us to our final panelist, Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who is based at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research focuses on trauma, state crimes and criminology, surveillance, gender violence, law and society. She's the author of numerous books, has published widely in multidisciplinary fields. And what is really important that I want to pick out from your bio is that as a resident of the old city of Jerusalem, Nadera is a prominent local activist. She engages in direct actions and critical dialogue to end the inscription of power over Palestinian children's lives, spaces of death, and women's birthing bodies and lives. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. And I'm really honored to be with all of you and honored to be with the South African group that was always part of the support system for us in Palestine. I'm speaking to you from the old city of occupied East Jerusalem. And my topic, I decided to share with you something that is not very developed in my work. I haven't written about it, but I thought this is the place to share it and to get your reactions and feedback. So feel free really to share with me your own analysis. Let me start, as I always start, by Noel, a 22-year-old mother from Silwan. Silwan is being attacked and people are being attacked by settlers and being under the threat of being evicted, like Sheikh Jarrah and other places in the old city of Jerusalem. And Nawal state, when I notice the secret services, those mukhabarat, the mistarivim that collect secret information about our community in courts when they're trying to defend my brother in health clinic or in social media, educational institution, even in our home, all my body, no, my heart inside me starts shivering. And I don't fear them, for we are powerful. I just remember how our mere breathing, our life, are located in a field of explosion. Guided by Nawal's words and her shivering heart, in this talk, I will first examine secrecy as violence that exposes and maintains the inherent instability of the political and the annihilation of resistance, and conclude by speaking about affirmative politics embedded in solidarity and resistance, countering the brutality of Zionism, insisting on commitment to the power of life. Agreeing to speak to you today is my way of finding a community of life in solidarity. So let me start. Fanon was concerned with the affective states exhibited by racialized subjects and what they produced during the social process of racialization, and suggested that we engage with the connection between the violence of the political and the psychic within the colonial context. He explained how colonialism is, or as, a factory where madness and mental disorder are being manufactured. In my talk, I wish to look at the omnipotence and omnipresence of secrecy within the Zionist settler colonial project, which evicts and uproots the colonized, maintains political instability, and impossibilizes livability for the native because it persecutes and traumatizes the mind and the psyche. So how does secrecy re-articulate the political? How does secret information operate politically? And how, via secrecy, are emotions and affects recycled into the political to allow the colonial state to claim the dangerousness, the disposability, and or terrorism of the other Palestinian here? Wissam stated, and I quote, "They imprisoned me based on secret information, and they revoked my residency status and evicted me from Jerusalem, although I was born in Jerusalem, all based on secret security information." Yasmin said, I quote, "They invaded the house in the middle of the night, claiming they have secret information about my political activism. Their secret information about me joining a reading group and assisting in organizing and exposing youth in our city became an accusation. I applied to many positions as a teacher, but their secret information prevented employers from recruiting me. Who knows whether I will ever find a job?" That's Yasmin, 23-year-old. And May stated, and I quote, "They know everything about us. They use their secret agents and always come up with what they call secret information to empty Jerusalem from Palestinians and Judaize. They collect data about health condition, about our medicine we take, social relations, economic benefits, social activism on the social media. They really penetrate our breathing. I stopped trusting people, even my own people, from fear." Now, secrecy and secret data that in many cases are not even based on actual fact, but are assembled to create a narrative that portrays Palestinians as dangerous others, hold much power socially, politically, economically. Its carceral command is an art of disciplinary power, incorporated into states' political formation and performances. The state uses secret entrapments to discipline. It uses it to surveil, to confine, to terrorize the subjects. It occupies militarily and extend outside the built wall of the prison. So those that are not inside the prison are also incarcerated, and to create yet more violence in the form of the penetration and dispossession. So secrecy, I claim, penetrates, it dismembers, and violates Wissam's family space, it violates Yasmin's home, it violates Nawal's shivering heart, producing various modes of state violence fashioned by the colonizers' formal and hidden lawfare. Colonization in Palestine teach us that the colonized lives are marked by secrecy and reduced to secret threats. Their social relations, aspirations, future plans, hopes, bodily safety, their income, their movement, their life, directly or by implication, are always disambled, producing a carceral reality. Now, Lema explained, and I quote, "The secret information they presented in the court resulted in the demolition of our home. As a woman, I experienced the demolition of my home as a major penetration of my body and viscerality. I felt naked without a roof, a right to have a home, an intimate space to be protected and build a family." Now, and end of quote. The penetration of secrecy operated through a number of laws performs the violence of Lema's housing demolition by the settler colonial state, which employs legality to justify violence and dispossession against the native. The settler state's jurisdiction to authorize demolition and expropriation produces a territorial governance and invention of new carceral entrapments against Lema and her family to justify the state's action. Her displacement resulted in leaving her, as she explained, totally naked, living under their unending policing. She described how the state's lies, and the claim that they have secret data is because of her family's political activism. She said, "These are secret lies to justify their lies. Their lies is state lies, These secret lies not only displaced Lema and her family, but it affected her children's life, their ability to study, to find a job, and so on." So state's obsession, and here I'm talking about the Israeli state's obsession, with secrecy permeates the political body. Deleuze and Guattari discuss secrecy, and they break it down into three components. For the first component, as the content in a box or an envelope. The second, as an action in terms of its secret influence and its propagation, spread, leakage, or secretion. And third, I quote, as the secret perception of the secret. I further detected the power of secrecy in its context, action, and perception, and in fact that secrecy in occupied East Jerusalem was not a skilled concealment, but as Michael Taussig called it, the skilled revelation of skilled concealment. Dispossession and surveillance via secrecy creates not only new carceral geographies, but also carceral psychologies that may silence the native because the state use of secrecy restructures or at least tries to restructure the affects and the affective zones in the person. But when the state uses the claim to secret information, or when the state reveals the colonized secret to continue its land grabbing and its home grabbing, in lieu with its logic of elimination, secrecy becomes a major mode of surveillance and mental entrapment that cannot be ignored. When we analyze that secrecy utilized in the state's global and local policing by using the analogy of secrecy in sexual abuse, we realize that the dynamic of secret within the abuse is always embedded in an intimate, complex, intrapsychic issue that furthers the power of secrecy, allowing it to maneuver, to asphyxiate, to scare, to maintain constant apprehension and create horror and shock without even physically touching the colonized community and individual. Governing the public and the intimate, policing with the state's secrecy apparatus and technologies is personal and effective. Through the violence of surveillance, the state uses cameras, satellites to collect and fabricate data that is later framed as security threat in an attempt to silence individuals and communities through scare tactics, arrest, detention, administrative detention, demolitions, and so on, and create a world of secrecy or classified material or evidence-based, call it whatever you want, stored in the state's secret places to manufacture facts that govern the colonized. Now, generating theory and research to understand the state and its allies, constructing facts, of course, and its epistemic violence, namely the role of secrecy in its state governance of reality and its so-called real threats, is major in analyzing the psychology of the oppressed. Secrecy as violence, I claim, in the colony manufactures crime, the criminal other, and the real threat based on racializing belonging that maintains the disposability of the colonized as the reality and the real threat. Palestinian history and present experiences show that secrecy is very visible and integrated within the state terror against Palestinians. Occupied East Jerusalem, as occupied Palestine, became a theater of secret concealment and exposed when Israeli military intelligence accuses even children, as my work on unchilding reveals, using what they define as classified material, only when it serves the government and the narrative it circulates. The settler state produces criminality and criminality that is routinely used to further the power of secret mystery in governing the colonized. Administrative detention, home imprisonment, actual incarceration is revealing, while at the same time conceals the power of darkness and secrecy because it silences dissent, or at least tries, and isolate individuals and communities geographically to entrap them psychologically. Iman was arrested, kept for over 2 weeks in solitary confinement. When she was finally released, she was bruised all over, her head, her face, under her chin. She suffered from severe nightmares, anxieties, restlessness, and other related psychological reactions. What struck me while visiting her was her fear for the safety of other members. She constantly left me to close her home's window, fearing the Israelis will come to arrest her, kill her family, demolish her house. When I tried to explain to her that she is back home with her family and no longer under arrest, she whispered, "They were 7 men. They hit me. They know everything about me. They see everything, even the shampoo I use to wash my body and hair. They see and know everything." The torture of the body, the penetration of the intimate, the violation of the right to breathe, and the invasion of the very private spaces, including knowing the shampoo brand, exposed the penetratability and power of the sovereign policing and secrecy usually buried within the immense information that weighed very little when colonized are facing their final verdict. When the Israeli military invaded Iman's home to arrest her, there was over 25 soldiers, and they searched the house and stayed there for over 3 hours. I told her that their uniforms have a built-in camera, and she responded, the cameras are connected to satellites and they can see and hear everything. And if we talk, they can kill my husband or maybe my father. They have secret information about us. Michael Tausing uses the term public secrecy to refer to that which is generally known but cannot generally be articulated. It's an, I quote, active not knowing, or I quote, knowing what not to know by those complicit in its production. Yeah, such secrecy to me is the hidden satellite that the colonial states apparatus thrives off, or the mukhabarat, and cannot function without it. It is that invasion and surveillance of the intimate, of the psychic, not only in torturing the colonized bodies in the name of security and its theology, but even in the shampoo brand that the heart of power, the policing apparatus and its satellite lies. Police militarization, I want you to remember, is turned into a secret profession, and secrecy becomes political capital in the hands of the state and is internationalized by becoming an industry that can be sold as combat proven and as money makers. Yeah, the colonial state impacts other countries by selling them arms, drones, and other technologies of secrecy. Israel sells these technologies to abuse countries, such as selling to India and to Modi to abuse Kashmiris, to the Myanmaris, to abuse Rohingyas. That industry of secrecy becomes a profession. Now, so if the settlers' work and if the settler states' work is to make even dreams of liberty impossible by the use of secret technologies, the natives' work, the colonized work, as you can all see from Palestine's resistance and youth resistance and action, is to imagine all possible methods for destroying it. So going back to where I started with Fanon, I want to argue that if one is to make use of Fanon's work today, one cannot separate the intellectual and the affective that are so intertwined in his analytical work and my analytical work on secrecy. Given the above, it's not surprising to see for Fanon that at the core of colonial racism was the attempt to rob the racialized individual of their inner safety and with time their aspiration. But Gaza, Jerusalem, and all Palestine continues to resist. Let me conclude. Secrecy in occupied East Jerusalem and in occupied Palestine is a structure of entrapment operating through lawfare and its various technologies of surveillance, resulting in a psychosocial dismemberment of and dispossession of land, home theft, and the maintenance of the occupied under psychological warfare. Secrecy allows violence to continue. Tausing explains that the effort to expose public secrets often paradoxically reinforce them for, and I quote, part of secrecy is secreting. And thus, and I continue, quote, exposure is precisely what the secrets intend. He asserts that public secrecy seems to have built-in protection against exposure because exposure, or at least a certain modality of exposure, is what in fact it thrives upon. In reality, I want to say that the true secret of public secret is that there is none, that in fact all is clearly revealed to the public gaze. So why? Why should we wait for more shivering hearts to stop beating? How can we work together to construct a solidarity under conditions of colonial secrecy? I believe without international solidarity, entrapment increases, deterrence increases, and we in Palestine are not lucky, like you in South Africa and your leadership, to gain enough international solidarity. And this is what we need at this point, yeah? How colonial secrecy can be challenged is by your help. It is challenged by the daily acts of the children in Palestine, daily acts of men and women, by a community of activists with amazing warmth, amazing love, and innovative resistance of youth fighting dispossession, and by the global solidarity in South Africa, in Kashmir, from native communities, Black Lives Matter activists, and around the world. Rejecting the colonial facts, rejecting reasoning and reason is crucial here. Yeah, the hegemonic reason. So the creation today of a psychic bonds and not material structures are the new terrain of history making. And I call all of you to act in solidarity against the colonial structure of entrapment, creating psychic bonds and new paths of livability against brutal uprooting. Thank you.
May I please ask the 4 panelists to switch on their cameras? Nadera, thank you. Rosa, Itumeleng, Stephen, can we have your cameras on, please? I really just want to acknowledge you. I want to acknowledge you as we've been listening to you. I've been receiving messages from the audience, from people who have joined us today, describing how they've been receiving your inputs. Our vice principal, who has joined us, has indicated on the chat that she found these stories quite, I will read, quite amazing, very moving. People have texted to say deeply profound, stirring. I will leave Professor Stevens, our moderator, to interact more with your inputs, but I really want to say to the audience members, can you please join me in giving the panelists a resounding round of virtual applause. Comrades, thank you. Thank you so much. You have engaged and set aflame. We talked about this on Thursday. You have set aflame the theme of the lecture series most compellingly, most powerfully. Thank you. I'm looking at our time, and I guess we are going to go a little after 5. I hope audience members, colleagues, comrades, that you will stay with us. I want to now introduce Professor Garth Stevens before I hand over to him for his reflections and the facilitation of this next round of our gathering. Professor Stevens, my friend, is a professor and clinical psychologist at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. His research interests include a foci on race, racism, and related social asymmetries, also on violence, collective trauma, and memory. There's so much to say about him. He has published widely. He has co-led the Apartheid Archive Project. He's currently a co-lead researcher on the Violent States of Violence Project. He's a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He's the Dean of Faculty of Humanities at WITS, and he's currently the president of the Psychological Society of South Africa. Garth, I hand over to you. Thank you for agreeing to moderate today. Thanks.
Thank you, Shanaz. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Thanks, Shanaz, for the kind introductions. And all I can say is wow. To Stephen, Itumeleng, Nadera, Rosa, for your wonderful inputs today. It's just been amazing to listen to you as we consider Solidarities, global social justice, and radical humanism in the contemporary world. And I know that Shanaz has used the ideas of the conjuncture and crisis by Stuart Hall, but I'm going to reveal my my age and predilections by saying that I suppose one can add to that in the Gramscian sense that we are in an interregnum with a significant number of morbid symptoms that characterize the global the globe today. Before we get into the Q&A, I thought I'd share a few thoughts, and I'm clearly not going to do justice to this today, given just the quality and the nature of the inputs. But let me try and say a few words that maybe stimulates a few thoughts. So I'll start with Stephen, if you don't mind. And Stephen, you reminded me of Dorothy Roberts' profound assertion, actually, that race is not a biological category that is politically charged, but is rather a political category that is disguised as a biological one. And this is important in the context of your talk, because I think this can be extended to think about racism that extends beyond the biological guise to also the rules of religion, nationality, ethnicity, and so on. Racism finds referent discourses to draw upon increasingly, and in the case of your talk, Islamophobia, and is perhaps what part of what Foucault would have called a dispositif. The overdetermined ways in which fractures and social cleavages are in some way systemically reinforced to ensure that they retain their elasticity and are constantly reinventing themselves in the face of resistance to them. But they, of course, constantly and recursively loop back into anti-Black racism and become a pretext for securitization and violence when they can. So I think it's important, of course, you know, if one thinks about xenophobia, Afrophobia, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and of course, forms of intra-Black community racialization itself, such as what we've seen recently in South Africa, in Phoenix and its surrounds, are all sites that reflect these spaces in which racism can be concealed. They can find moments of obfuscation. And, you know, these are all therefore very distinct, but they are also related, and they provide us with opportunities for solidarity against the legacies of coloniality, race, racism, and related social asymmetries. Rosa, your input prompted a recollection of Milan Kundera's quote, and I quote, "The first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then have someone else write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. And before long, the nation will begin to forget what it is and what it was." And I think importantly for me, accounts from people, ordinary people, the quotidian, the everyday, are essentially a form of psychosocial mnemonics. It is a memory device of sorts, if you will, that is opposed to the kind of grand narratives of history. It promotes the democratization of histories, the plurality of histories, and these are all important as part of a decolonial project. So as accounts are told, and retold, of course, they change all the time. They reformulated, they're never static, they're always being remade. And memory in this way is not a frozen temporality of the past. It is not a frozen moment that remains static, but it is, of course, a story that is unfolding in the present and potentially also about the future. It generates affective resonances with others, and even, I suppose, what some would refer to as prosthetic memories. So that even if the memory is not truly shared by everyone, it is nevertheless a site of commonality and potential solidarity about the past, about the present, and about moving to a new future. This is critical to the decolonial project in some ways, because of course, what we are attempting to offset is the kind of cultural decimation of oppressed and marginalized groups associated with coloniality itself. So thanks. Nadera, thanks for your insights on secrecy. I think it's some wonderful work. I look forward to seeing it in whatever form it is that you're going to find it articulable. It reminded me of a South African writer, Jacob Dlamini, who writes on this process as something that he refers to as a fatal intimacy in a book called Askari. And it is essentially a book about how it is that one starts to see public sovereign infiltration in our social life. And I suppose what struck me about what you were talking about was really how you start to see public sovereign infiltration, penetration, and intrusion into social life, but beyond that, into the body and the psyche, raising the possibilities for a private disciplining of bodies and affects. But I suppose what was important for me was that it also raised the possibilities of a counter-politics of embodiment and a politics of affectivity, which I think is also really something quite important for us to think about. This too is a site for collective solidarities based on experience that is not easily conveyed in the traditional form of text, of course. but it can stymie solidarities if they are kept as secrets. And so I was thinking about how it is that the politics of affectivity and embodiment, fear, paranoia, can also become a site of resistance. And, you know, I think about the work by Lauren Wilcox when she talks about how we use bodies in protest that challenge, for example, middle-class sensibilities. And yeah, I think about marches that have been about queering cities, or we use the body as a canvas when we use T-shirts with slogans, or we use the body as a site of death itself, for example, in the hunger strike. Or we reframe affective experiences as more than simply a primordial reaction to some experience, but that it is actually a political response. So, for example, when we think about embodied Black rage in the face of coloniality, or, for example, when we expose the very surveillance systems that underpin the securitization and the terror of authoritarian societies. These are some alternative parts of history that are not spoken of and need to be made much more articulable in some form or another, or they can confound internal coherence amongst oppressed groups and solidarities across those groups. So again, thank you for the wonderful talk. Itumeleng, a poignant recollection on your experiences in South Africa and Palestine, and the focus on youth in particular. What came to mind for me here was the work on nostalgia by writers like Svetlana Boym, who of course speaks about restorative and reflective nostalgia. Restorative nostalgia being a longing for an idealized and pristine past, you know, that we yearn for, the good old bad days, for example. While reflective nostalgia is an attempt to deal with the losses of a past, and more particularly the unfinished business of pasts, a recommitment to a new form of addressing that unfinished business. And again, this for me is a site of new solidarities, especially in authoritarian and post-authoritarian societies in which political and social transformation is yet to be fully realized. And here I speak not only of the sites in the global north, but also Brazil, Venezuela, South Africa, Palestine, India, Tero, and many other sites in the world today. I recall a message, a slogan from the 1980s and the 1990s as a youth activist. And the youth are indeed the flowers of the future and the reason for our struggles. So thank you. Let me conclude by just saying one matter on the, one thing on the matter of radical humanism. And here I want to take from the work of Alexander Wehelie, who notes that central to defining the modern Western conception of what it means to be human has been the use of a range of assemblages, mechanisms as part of the process of disciplining humanity into humans, not quite humans, and non-humans, right from the onset of Western modernity itself. In other words, an anthropocentric view of the human. We center the human in the totality of our experience and our existence. We exclude environments, ecologies, other species on the planet, and so on. His argument is really audacious, as it has two consequences for us. The first is that if this genre of human, less than human, and non-human that characterizes our thinking today can be approached differently, especially if we pivot and speak from the perspective of those who are considered not quite human or less than human or non-human, then perhaps we can start to rethink what the very idea of the human means and challenge the very nature of the fractures and the binaries of our world today. How we conceptualize being human should perhaps be approached from the vantage point of those, the very people who have been excluded from this domain of human, those in the zone of non-being, as Fanon would have referred to it. And this is perhaps one useful point of departure. So thank you to all of you again. I thought I would just offer those reflections, and let me end there perhaps and open up for some questions at this point from the audience. I'm looking at the chat box, and one of the first issues, of course, that came up was really the question of global solidarity. And I suppose I'm going to just frame the question as it has come up to me, and that is, how do we push the ideals of a global solidarity when nation states continue to foreground nationalism? And the example that's been used is vaccine nationalism, for example, but there are many other forms of nationalism that we see. And how does one think about solidarity or global solidarities in this time when nationalism, of course, becomes such a central feature of the organizing parameters of the world today. Maybe related to that, I suppose what one can add to that is, if one thinks about the fact that global solidarities and what we would have continued to think about the traditional leftist movements of the 20th century that have now perhaps receded into the background of our body politic, what are the new organic social movements and what would they look like? What can we anticipate into the future in this kind of context? So let me start with that and then ask any of you, I don't want to put any of you under additional pressure here, but let me start with that, some of my reflections, and then that first question, and see if there are any takers from any of you. At the same time that you're thinking about this, maybe I should give you an opportunity to think. There's another question that's come up on the Q&A, and let me just throw this one out there as well. You may want to have a couple of these, and so you can mull over these in the meantime. The question is essentially: the injustices suffered by the Palestinians have now existed since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, despite numerous attempts to bring about a peaceful solution, one or two states. What prevents a radical solution in the view of the panelists? Nadera, you wanting to come in?
Okay. First of all, thank you for your insight, Garth. I think that, and I need more of those insights, because deciding to talk about secrecy is exactly where the psychological and the political are meeting, and how, especially in the context of Palestine and in Zionism, the mind and playing on the mind, as Fanon have taught us, is major. And the problem is that the production of epistemic violence that is being traded and sold and believed in, and causing so much violence, not only to Palestinians, but to other groups, is at stake. So when you were talking about sovereign infiltration, all that came to my mind is how the Palestinians, including my own mom and dad, in 1948, during the early years of the Nakba and the establishment of the settler state, they were called, when they tried to return back to Haifa, where they were evicted from, they were called infiltrators. So now you're bringing to the table sovereign infiltrator as opposite to how my own parents as Palestinians, when they were trying to return to their homeland, so the return of a refugee to home was defined legally by the settler colonial state as infiltrator. So again, that tells us how colonialism was done legally, and its legality that is serving the hegemon. And here you point the importance of looking at the sovereign infiltration as violation and as violence, and as state violence. And yes, there is a need for counter politics of affectivity. And I think that counter politics, I see it when I read the work of South African scholars or Kashmiri scholars, Zia Athar comes to my mind, or Muhammad Jnaid, that talks about affective solidarity. Affective solidarity is solidarity between here, South Africa, people that are very active in Italy and otherwise, but really talks that can acknowledge the fear produced by the hegemon. If I point to my previous book, not the new one on unchilding, but rather on security theology, we are faced with a major theology that comes from two spaces in India. And here I'm responding to one of the questions you proposed. We have the biblical theology where the Bible is their title and God gave them the land to evict us from our land. So it's that biblical theology, and then the security theology, that security and securitization and the production of the Palestinian in zoological terms, if I use Fanon's analysis. And here, there are two things that are being activated. Number one, constructing Palestinians as feared others. Number two, the hegemon and the state and the settler state claims that they fear us. So the production of fear, to fear us more, to produce themselves, to produce us as fear the others is hard at work. So how do we look at Palestinian case study? Through the sacralization of politics, because my latest edited book with my colleague Nadim Rouhana is really entitled The Sacralization of Politics. It's that politics that became sacred. So Christian organizations and entities are supporting Zionism, are looking at the Bible as a deed, and Ben Gurion have said it. And let me remind you that Ben Gurion was secular. But yes, they're secular, they don't believe in God, but God gave them the land. So that is really a very complicated situation. And we in Palestine are continuing to resist. You see it in the acts of little kids, until the very old, yeah? You see it daily, but there is a real need for continuous psychological bond and effective solidarity and actual solidarity to maintain the power of the Palestinian to continue the resistance. Because as you can see in my work on children are constantly unchilded. When you were talking about the penetration into the psychic, all that came to my mind is the case of Ahmad Manasra, who was 12-year-old, who was tortured to state that he was trying to stab somebody. And he kept on screaming, Mish Mitzakker, I don't remember. Now that psychological reaction to those investigators that are bringing that secret information to tell him, no, you stabbed. And mind you, this kid ended up with a verdict of 13 years, and he is serving in prison. The Israeli law was changed to manage the contradictions in this case. So yes, as Denise de Silva have said, Palestinians are located at the limits of humanity, and only by challenging this and saying, no, you cannot unchild our children. These are children. You cannot unparent. You cannot unfather. You cannot evict Palestinian from the humanity. Decolonization cannot continue. So decolonization is the answer, and decolonization is really to decolonize everything, stop that violence, and work together in solidarity to bring justice to the situation, to our situation here.
Thanks, Nadia. I wondered if Rosa or Stephen or Itumeleng wanted to come in at this point as well. I'm mindful of time, and so I'm going to ask you all to just give your thoughts as briefly as possible so that we can take as many possible questions out there. Rosa, Stephen, anything from you? Itumeleng?
Garth, if I may.
Please go ahead.
I just wanted, first of all, thank you so much for your incisive comments on our inputs. This really furthers my own thoughts on memory and its role in radical humanism and decoloniality. But I wanted to speak a little bit on this notion of global solidarity that was posed in the Q&A box. I'm not sure I can actually answer how do we push global solidarity in such a brief period. But I think what I wanted to, and what I've been curious about, is how we understand the very notion of global solidarity itself. So what are the infrastructural, political, economic conditions and material practices that both limit and make possible solidarity that is global? How does it engage with questions of difference? So, so solidarity is not about erasing difference, but is in fact grappling with and dealing with difference in order to push forward an agenda, a political agenda. How does it deal with coloniality and the entanglements of histories and differential power relations between groups of people and between nations? And what can we learn from local struggles and local contexts and scale this up to what we would consider solidarity that is global? In the context of the pandemic and the vaccine nationalism that we're seeing now, I think what's being highlighted really is that one can speak, political leaders can speak about solidarity, and it's so obvious to us that these are empty words and empty promises. So the very word solidarity itself has been co-opted, and so to me, what actually would be relevant really is to have a radical notion of solidarity that criticizes the ways in which the very term itself has been co-opted, watered down, and become performative in many ways. And what can we learn from movements such as Black Lives Matter, and some of this, more recent, more global movements in how this were done and how this touch people. So to me, I'm interested in emotions and affect. So this notion of affective solidarity to me is also extremely important. But at the end of the day, how do we deal with difference? How do we deal with coloniality and inequalities in power relations in order to actually push forward solidarity that is global in scale? So I'm not really answering that question directly, but putting more questions on the table as we forward our conversation on this topic, hopefully in succeeding events, hopefully.
Thanks, Rosa. Anybody else wanting to come in? Stephen.
I just very briefly, because I know this time is an issue, and I want to thank you all and thank you, Garth, for this incredibly erudite and smart and sharp words that you offered, and just the build on Rosa. What and the questions at hand, and some of the points you had, the last question you sort of said about sort of looking to the future and new forms of resistance and struggle and building and community building. I struggle with this a lot, and I think again this is to some degree to build on what Rosa is saying. I'm always struck by how we're asked to think about and venerate and uplift ancestors, right? On one hand, I think there's always a danger in that, because what happens is we end up fetishizing them, and then you end up having state capture, right, after the liberation, right? But on the other hand, I think we also then look back, and sometimes we're too smart, and we look back at our ancestors and say, oh, they did this wrong, and then they did Fanon was a sexist and and this is what, these guys were authoritarian. And I think we have a problem with being too smart sometimes. And I think sometimes we have to actually go back and listen to our ancestors, even though when we know that they were wrong. So to not be burdened, in other words, with thinking about the new, but thinking about actually what worked. Because some of us do live in liberated countries, even though the post-colonial condition ended up having state capture, et cetera, right? So I think that the issue of solidarity is beautiful and important, but I think those answers are have been given to us by the generation of Fanon, for example, and Cabral have talked about this, and folks, until neoliberal imperialist capitalism has tried to crush and erase this, if you want to speak about memory. And that is in particular the concept of internationalism. And internationalism, to some degree, is an incredibly powerful concept, because it draws us and demands solidarity, but also understands how difference does work, right? So I think we have to, it's important for us to always think about the successes of our ancestors, and to hold the successes, and even when we look back and diagnose what they did this as wrong, they should have done this, and they should, no, just to say at that moment they were doing what was right, at that moment their revolutionary fire and potential and insight was correct, right? And then so when we hear about leftist organizations going back and rejecting certain things, which are like, no, we shouldn't be rejecting these things. They were moments, right? Because when we start to think too much about, when we start to fetishize the ancestors, in particular uncritical ways, I understand, we end up having the Palestinian Authority, right? But on the other hand, we want to look back and say, what is it that the Palestinian Authority, for example, the PLO, has rejected now to become in power, right? And we look at what they rejected, and it's that internationalism, it's that revolutionary fire that should guide us. So I don't know if this is too abstract, but I just want to sort of, again, not burden us with necessarily the task of trying to think about new forms, because revolution did happen, liberation did happen, mobilization did happen. It was the popular revolution, the revolution from the masses. And Cabral talks about this, and so many folks teach us this, and those lessons are there for us to follow and to mobilize them in our particular moment, in this particular conjunction, to build on what Shanaz was saying. So, and I thank you for allowing the space to happen to think through that.
Thanks. Colleagues are mindful of time, but there are one or two additional questions. So I'm going to throw these out as the last two for now, and then we're probably going to have to move towards conclusion. But the one question that's come up is, firstly, there's been a thanks for the great contributions from Hugo Canham. I'm saddened by the position in which minoritized people and the affective labor of this constant refusal and resistance. The joy and pleasure of life is sometimes overshadowed. I wonder how we can engage in scholarship and activism that is simultaneously attentive to refusal, rage, and pleasure. And that's the one question. The second is really a question about how it is that one can start to think about reviving traditions that have in fact been successful in the past. And I think, Stephen, it's starting to speak to some of what you were saying. So the question was really, how does one think about reviving something like the Black consciousness movement when one thinks about anti-Black racism in the world today, and the strength of Black consciousness in a moment of our history across the world that was so profound to resist anti-Black racism. So let me leave those two with you right now. And any takers from any of you, or any last comments from any of you as well?
Maybe I'll say something about refusal, because I really think it's major at this point. It's major. And refusal goes on, really, scholarship of refusal is what we need. But we also need lots of support to be able to publish such scholarship. And I think that if there's something that we see today, we see scholarship that is that mainstream scholarship, that is evidence-based scholarship, that is out, that is really silencing our students, the young generation. And I guess naming is very important. So when someone is called terrorist, please let us rethink it and let us challenge it. When all of a sudden discussing the activism of children over here in Jerusalem, they're all defined as lone wolves. So lone wolves is wolfing, is animalizing, and lone is saying, no, this is an individual act of a psychotic pathology. No, it's not individual. There's history of oppression. We need to look at the structure. It's not an event. We need to look at the fact that there is a tendency, or the plan is to evict the native and indigenize the settler, and it's built on a logic of elimination. So what I say is scholarship of refusal is important, but looking at not only the scholarship, but those acts, those little acts, such as the walk to school under the rifles of the Israeli in occupied East Jerusalem, is an act of refusal. So I guess naming, framing, analyzing, writing, listening to you today and listening to the different voices, we need it. I can tell you I need it as Nadera, and my students need it. So we need to continue the discussions.
Great, thanks, Nadera. Rosa, Stephen, Itumeleng, anything from your side? Any responses? Any final words? Itumeleng, do you want to come in? Itumeleng, we're seeing a raised hand, but we can't hear you.
Hello?
There we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. My parting words to the collective in the sitting is that I see there is power in, collective historical memory, and the lessons of the struggles today depend on how we document them today. With that said, I speak with the mind of the importance of the intergenerational conversations. Yes, as Stephen rightfully points out, that our predecessors have made some mistakes, but it doesn't mean we ought to dismiss their contribution in today's struggles. If anything, they are also looking at what's happening today in hindsight, reflective of their own mistakes, and they also thirst for the collaboration between today's youth and their generation of young people, because these struggles are intergenerational. The nature of civic activism today indicates a paradigm shift into an epoch of governments without politicians, not dictated by perimeters of political parties and the so-called liberation movement, because that is also part of the fragmentation that we see constantly recycling itself. So with that said, there is a call for action from communities to unite in unison and act in unison. And that's the only way we can realize true solidarity, because grassroots movements are important. Liberation leaders or so-called government officials from the top have no interest in changing the system as it stands right now. So it is up to us in the communities to speak to one another at that level. In Palestine, I learned that in actual fact, there isn't a difference between community and family. And sometimes these words are used interchangeably. So we need to find that level of connectedness so that we can realize our humanness together. So there is a definite need in restoring the social fabric that has been tarnished by the system of dispossession, which Nadera so wonderfully put it out, how the intimate space was invaded and it was made to feel unsafe. It was made to inspire fear. It was made to animalize communities and render them in a state of other, instead of just uniting people and seeing the unity that we share. So we hear a lot about the two-state solution. We hear a lot about, no, we don't hate Israelis or we don't hate Palestinians or this or that. But the only way that can truly come into sense is if we recognize the humanity that's within us. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Itumeleng. Rosa, Stephen, any last thoughts or comments or responses from you?
I know we have very little time, and the comment who was thinking about pleasure, and that is, I don't think we need to think about pleasure and refusal as two different things, right? For us, pleasure refusal is affirmation. We think about it's not to affirm ourselves is to refuse their projections, it's to refuse their introjections, right? So a refusal is an act of affirmation. It is an act of presence, and when we live and embody that affirmation, when we live and embody refusal, when we live and embody our own presence, this is the source of pleasure, right? Black consciousness and Biko has taught us, if nothing else, that you start at a place of affirming your own humanity. And it's not that, and to build on Sister Itumeleng, what she just said, is it's not to say that, oh, we just recognize the humanity in us and I'm going to go hug it out with the Zionists. I'm not. Because it's the Zionists, it's the white supremacists that negates our humanity. And our refusal is the refusal to accept that interjection. It's this refusal of that projection onto us of animalization, right? And when we refuse, we accept and we center our own humanity and our own, that's what consciousness is. And it's from there that pleasure truly becomes pleasure, not some sort of displaced pleasure where we have to think about pleasure is really dissociation. It's dissociation with our misery. No, it's us rejecting that, right? And so it's our affirmation that builds is the bedrock of pleasure.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Rosa?
Very quickly, also just jumping in from what Stephen had said and from the question on refusal, rage, and pleasure, completely agree. And I just wanted to also highlight how, in decoloniality, there's also a big, critique of this Cartesian dualism, and how we have to, break that, and how, for instance, Abdulah talks about the erotic, the importance of anger in activism, and also the importance of being in touch with our bodies in what we do. And I think what Stephen had mentioned in terms of refusal, in terms of rage, and how I'm thinking more that, in our everyday refusals and the everyday act of it, these are always tiny acts of counter-ontology, tiny acts of resistance that can build up into something bigger, right? And it's how we take this everydayness and building it up to something bigger and much more broader beyond the local struggles towards a much more global struggle, where we can perhaps find one way towards achieving this notion of global social justice. That's very much really rooted a lot in how we've been talking about this, redefining what humanness is, and that's a lot of everyday acts of refusal in being dictated upon on what human is. And then I just wanted to then also kind of end by saying that there's also a pushback necessary to make sure that how these are understood are not racialized and gendered, right? When we talk about anger, it's gendered, it's racialized, and when you speak with that kind of acceptance of that emotion, that you get dismissed for that, for being, oh, she's the angry Black woman, or she's the angry brown woman, and what you're saying is no longer being heard, right? So that's active refusal in that too, by virtue of actually performing that, of asserting that, is refusing to be subjected to that kind of judgment. So it's this everyday acts, these little moments, I think, that also matters a lot. And I think everyone, for this moment, this has been very rejuvenating for me.
Thanks, Rosa. Let me just say, everybody, that I think it's just been a wonderful session. I know that there's going to be a formal thanks after this, but I wanted to thank Nadera, I wanted to thank Stephen, Itumeleng, Rosa. It's just been absolutely kind of intellectually and spiritually nourishing to listen to all of you. It's really been an excellent session to have voices from across the world speaking in such similar terms, and for us to really be able to, in some ways, embody and epitomize the kind of solidarities that we are talking about today. So really our great appreciation to all of you for your inputs today. And with that, I think I'm going to be handing over to Ongezwa. But let me also just say to all of you who have posted your questions either on the chat or the Q&A, I know we haven't been able to get to all of your questions and to all of your comments, but thank you so much for being participants in this and for being so engaged with all of this. We hope that we're going to be able to take this forward in some form or another year after. With that, I'm going to hand over to Ongezwa.
Having congregated in the name of love for our humanity and done the labor of love for our humanity, walk with the words and aspiration that this collective has gifted you with today. Know that you are not alone in this journey of seeking justice and peace. This journey is long and exhausting and mountainous. So when the journey seems tough, as if you are climbing Table Mountain, take time to rest. Take time to rest and breathe. And breathe. In these times we found ourselves, breathing is the most mundane, revolutionary act of our time. In these times we found ourselves in, breathing is the most mundane revolutionary act of our time. To love humanity time and time and time again is radically hope in the mirage of injustice. To love humanity is what you have done today. To speak from your hearts, to speak from your truth. It is a meditative love. A love that questions your sanity in the midst of it all. It is a love that we are willing to live for in the midst of us being tested and being called to die. Uthando, love, in the spectrum of umthandazo, prayer. Uthando, in the spectrum of umthandazo, these two walk together in marriage. We will love and pray for our humanity. So, may you arm yourself with love and gentleness as we fight relentlessly for what is at stake, our children's future and presence. Go well and prepare to continue this walk in justice. When the walk, or when the ground you walk in and on becomes slippery, root yourself in love for justice. Those who have come before us walk with us in the present, and those who have fought for us, before us, walk with us in the present. Jazz it up. If you do dance to the songs of umzabalazo. Do pray to the hymns of jazz. You have been called to do this work. Trust this calling. We thank you for your gifts. May you use them to their fullest capacity. May you serve with your gifts. We thank you.
And we thank you, Ongezwa. You ushered us in, inspiring us to talk, to say it, to do it. And certainly the panelists, everyone on the program really, I'm just struck by the ways in which you all brought yourself into this conversation. I'm talking about what you said, but certainly I'm talking about so much more. You remind us to keep radical joy alive as we do the work that needs to be done. And you have all said it all. So as we begin, as you usher us out, there's really very little left for me to say. We have had a closing message on the program from Professor Sats Cooper, but he had another engagement. So from what I can see, he's had to leave. Professor Masimola has been able to rejoin us. Prof, I wonder if there's anything you want to add before we close and before we move to the vote of thanks.
So thank you very much, Shanasa, for this very wonderful interlocution. It has brought to surface a lot of the things that have been marginalized in the discourses on Palestine in particular. And I'm glad that looking back in retrospect, when I'd gone to An-Najjar University in Nablus in Palestine, in the territories, and I found that there's a lot of annexation that is articulating a particular form of colonial violence. And there is a lot of scholarship, I must say, that has also been swept under the carpet by scholars such as Deleuze, who had worked quite a lot with Palestinian scholars such as Elias Sunbar about the way in which the articulation of capitalism finds expression in colonial expansion of the type that we find in Israeli expansion. And I find that the discussion today has shown what Professor Gus Stevens has articulated as a Fanunian type of a zone, production of a zone of non-being. And I'm encouraged that on this particular occasion, we've had diverse voices. And I'm glad that there is a privileging of Palestinian voices in this, because oftentimes, as Edward Said has cautioned us, we find that we are so overwhelmed by discourses of scholarship that the Palestinian experience itself is diminished. And even the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish would articulate the place and the significance of Palestine in the recuperation of the humanism of Palestine. And today, the question of land has been central to the discussion above all things, because oftentimes we talk about the two-nation state and privilege the idea of the state to a point where we forget that statism itself is a function of and is overdetermined by capitalism, which is global. And it is also violent in Israel. And we find that no matter what the external world says, no matter what the Oslo Agreement would say, the United Nations would promulgate, still we need to ascribe importance to the agency and the land of Palestinians. And at this point, I think it is apt that we return once again, to my mind, to that question that was posed by Edward Said. And I say this because the question of memory has been raised many a time by different speakers. And Said says there is no getting away from the fact that as an idea, as a memory, and as an often buried or invisible reality, Palestine and its people have simply not disappeared. No matter the sustained and unbroken hostility of the Israeli establishment to anything that Palestine represents, the sheer fact of our existence has foiled where it has not defeated the Israeli effort to be rid of us completely, end quote. And I think that's a very poignant statement about the ontological invisibility of Palestinians, the ontological insecurity of Palestinians. The moment of solidarity is there. And in fact, the lines of separation between the Israelis and Palestine is founded on the idea of difference. And again, I return to Edward Said, the idea of victims of Nazism practicing another form of discrimination against other humans. And Said said there has to be a limit to it. And right now, I would like to end it on that note and thank all of the speakers that have contributed to this very rich discourse, the panelists that have done so well to open up the spaces for us to participate as those that hold hands with Palestine, that hold hands with even Afro-American brothers and sisters over there, who are also experiencing a kind of hostility ever since there has been the globalization of terror, the socialization of the idea that Islam equals terror in the United States. And it didn't begin now. It began from the time when the words, the Black Panther movement, and even before. We find that in New York, people like Farah Khan, Khalid Muhammad, who have stood so bravely to resist racism that has been intertwined with anti-Islamism. And behind all of this, we find that in the backlash, we have been told about anti-Semitism, but it happens even in the academy. And I want us to address it squarely within the academy in the forms that the webinar has taken. And I want to thank all the speakers that have come in today. And in the spirit of Dola, Omar, and Joe Moabi, I want us to push the boundaries of human justice and solidarity. Thank you, Shanaz, and thank you, Professor Mohammed, and thank you, Gus Stevens. I want to thank also my colleague, the chair of the Albert Institute Chair, Professor Itumeleng Moabi, for contributing to this broader meditation, and say to all of you, peace, light, and love. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Masimola. I also want to take this opportunity before we end to recognize our Professor Nadera Moabi, our Vice Principal of Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation, and Commercialization. She is in the background. Thanks for your support as well, Prof. Finally, I guess I'm so reluctant to end this, and so many of you have stayed with us. Thank you. Finally, Ongezwa, you talked about love, prayer, and radical jazz, as I said to you in the chat a few moments ago. So we will end on the note of love, prayer, and radical jazz, certainly, but not before Nomagugu Ngwenya, and I'll introduce her properly in a moment, delivers a vote of thanks on behalf of the Institute. Before I hand over to you, though, Nomagugu, I want to say thank you to my head of department, my friend, my comrade, my accomplice, Professor Mohammed Sidat, who is here somewhere, lurking in the background, who has had much to do with this, with today's lecture, with this engagement. So Mohammed, thank you very much. Nomagugu is a young person, a very impressive young person, junior researcher at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences. She does amazing work, and most recently, her research interests have included a focus on race relations, gender and feminism, and holistic approaches to community health and well-being. She does amazing work, but she has a presence that lingers. And so, Nomagugu, it's very appropriate then that before we connect with the jazz, you do the thanks on behalf of the Institute and on behalf of UNISA. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shanaz. Am I audible, everyone?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to present the official votes of thanks for today's lecture on behalf of all the hosts. We would firstly like to thank the Omar and Moabi families for giving us reason to gather for yet another year, for your unremitting support for the lecture, and the critical issues that it seeks to highlight is deeply appreciated. Thank you to the panelists, Professor Stephen Sheehi, Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, Dr. Rosa Castillo, and Itumeleng Moabi, for your deep engagements today and for so generously contributing to the much-needed conversations on solidarities, global social justice, and radical humanism. We look forward to more of these with you. We would also like to thank our co-hosts, the Psychological Society of South Africa, specifically Fatima Sidat and Mohammed Kasim, the Pan-African Psychology Union, and of course, Professor Nadera Moabi, UNISA's Vice Principal, Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation, and Commercialization. Thank you all for your collaboration and your commitment to the kinds of activism this lecture series invites. Thank you to Professor Garth Stevens for moderating so skillfully and contributing to the valuable insights and the pressing questions emerging from the panelists' inputs and audience participation. Thank you as well to Professor Itumeleng Moabi and Professor Homotso Masemola for your much needed warm welcome messages today, and Professor Masemola again for closing on behalf of Professor Safs Cooper, who unfortunately had to leave us. Your closing message further extends our collective reflections today on solidarities, global social justice, and radical humanism. Of course, thank you to Ongezwa Mbele for the creative pieces you performed so deeply and so movingly for us today. Additionally, thank you to Professor Mohammed Sidat and Professor Shanaz Safla for your resolve towards sustaining the critical engagements to which this lecture series talks. To Josephine Cornell, for your efficient assistance in the planning of this lecture and your determination to fulfilling the vision for this event. And lastly, thank you to the audience for joining us today, for your contributions, and for enabling our comrades to be commemorated on this platform for yet another year. I wish you all a good day further. In closing, we will end with yet another beautiful piece of music titled Yakalinkomo, which means the cow cries, by Winston Mankukungozi. Thank you all.